It's time for the video I know some of you are eager to see. The one where I take my first look at the Legend of Spyro series, a trilogy of games that up until now I'd never touched. Today I'll be concentrating on the first game in this reboot trilogy, A New Beginning. Leading up to this video, you guys left plenty of comments about how much you love the Legend of Spyro series, but I do know for a fact that this reboot gets an equal amount of flack as it does praise. It's kind of a Marmite thing. People either seem to love the Legend of Spyro, or absolutely despise its very being. I've also heard that all three games are a complete mix in terms of enjoyment, with A New Beginning being so-so, The Eternal Night being terrible, and Dawn of the Dragon being the most fun out of all three. I don't know how true that is, but given A New Beginning had me feeling a bit at times, that opinion hasn't been wrong so far. I guess I'll have to see as I continue through the series. Now, given these three games are a reboot of Spyro and his origins, I'm going to be fair and try not to compare them to previous games, at least until the gameplay section. You guys already know I'm a huge fan of the original trilogy, and comparing such different styles of games to each other would make for a very biased video. Instead, I'll treat The Legend of Spyro as a standalone series. Besides, you guys know enough about the previous games to make your own decisions about this reboot. Oh, and I'm playing the PS2 version of A New Beginning for anyone curious. Enough babbling from me anyway, I'll start off with development. A New Beginning was developed by Krome Studios, an Australian video game company founded in 1999. They in turn had been given the task of creating a fresh Spyro trilogy by American developers and publishers Sierra Entertainment. Krome Studios have worked on titles such as Ty the Tasmanian Tiger, Blade Kitten, and Star Wars The Force Unleashed. A New Beginning was developed not only for the PS2, GameCube and Xbox, but handheld versions were also released for the Nintendo DS and Game Boy Advance. Judging from the very little amount of footage I have watched, the story appears to be more or less the same, but the actual gameplay is very different. The Nintendo DS version gives the player an isometric view of the world, whereas the Game Boy Advance version is a side-scroller. All console and handheld versions of the game were released in 2006, between the 10th of October and the 2nd of November, for North America, Europe and Australasia. Now, normally this is where I run out of stuff to talk about, and I start desperately perusing the Wikipedia page for that last tidbit of information. Luckily, I have been pointed in the direction of Jared Pullen, the lead concept artist for the Legend of Spyro series. Thank you so much to Emile DeBoss for telling me about this guy. Jared Pullen actually has a DeviantArt page where he's uploaded concept art for the three games, and he's even done a Q&A about the characters. I've put a link to both in the description below if you want to check them out for yourself, but as this video goes on, I will make mention of the stuff he writes about, particularly characters, their looks, and their relationship to Spyro. Bear in mind that what he tells us isn't technically canon, as it was never mentioned in the games. The Q&A writer, Dragon of Ice and Fire, even stresses this point, stating, 90% of the stuff here is only unused ideas or speculation from Jared's end. It is not canon. Don't go pissing on people with theories and stories that differ from what you've read here. If it wasn't in the game, it's not canon. Anyway, moving on to story, world, and characters. The story for The Legend of Spyro A New Beginning starts off with a cutscene showing us an as yet unnamed red dragon. We learn that it's currently the Year of the Dragon, nice plug there, and that wherever this dragon currently is, it's a world beyond the realms. He breathes fire on some sort of magical seal, which opens up a doorway into a large temple containing multiple dragon eggs. The red dragon explains that he, and others like him, are awaiting the birth of a prophesized dragon. I bet we can guess who that is. The guardian dragons know the eggs are in danger, as the Dark Master has already heard of said prophecy and seeks to destroy these eggs before the prophesized dragon can be born. As the red dragon watches over a purple egg, the temple suddenly shakes violently. A yellow dragon appears and tells the red dragon to save the eggs as the dark armies have come. The red dragon, realising he doesn't have time to save them all, quickly grabs the purple egg, creates another magical doorway with his fire breath, and flies away from the temple. Knowing he can't leave the temple and other dragon eggs to their fate, he finds a place to hide the precious purple egg. He takes the head of a mushroom and places the egg inside before pushing it downriver. He flies back to the temple and looks on in shock, but we don't get to see what he's staring at until later in the game. The cutscene fades to show us the purple dragon egg continuing on its merry way down the river, before finally coming to rest in a swamp far from the temple. Two dragonflies find the egg just in time for it to hatch, and the cutscene fades once again. We then move from pre-rendered cinematics to in-game cinematics, and the dragon that hatched from the purple egg is revealed to be none other than Spyro! Oh my gosh, who would have guessed? The dragonflies raise Spyro as one of their own, alongside his surrogate brother Sparx, who was born on the same day. So far, we don't know a lot about this version of Spyro, apart from what he looks like. Sparx, on the other hand, well, I can tell he's going to annoy me from his first few lines.
What's the matter, little Spyro? You can't fly? Oh, that's right, you walk everywhere. That's too bad.
This first area the game starts in is mainly swamp, with all sorts of swampy, fantastical things like giant mushrooms, pools of goop, and plant-like creatures. Oh, and brown. Just lots and lots of brown. Spyro chases Sparx through the swamp, which is basically to give the player a chance to learn how to move and fight. The fighting part is necessary in order to save Sparx from the frogweeds that gobble him up, and the baboon-like creatures, simply called apes, that capture him and place him in a cage. Sparx is about to be crushed by the largest ape, when Spyro suddenly unleashes a torrent of flame. Spyro finishes off the few remaining ape stragglers, releases Sparx, and the two head back to Mummy and Daddy Dragonfly to tell them about their interesting day. It's then they explain to Spyro he isn't a dragonfly after all, shocker, but an exile from an unknown, distant land. Spyro decides to set off and find out who and what he truly is, much to Sparx's chagrin. Come on dude, your brother just found out that not only is he not what he thought he was his entire life, but he came from elsewhere, and there are possibly others just like him wherever elsewhere is. And you're gonna act like that. I'll just add this to the ever-growing list of why I hate Sparx in this game. After a pep talk from surrogate mum and dad, Spyro sets off on his own through the swamp, fighting frogweeds, bulb spiders, and more apes as he goes. Unfortunately for me, Sparx decides to forgive Spyro and join him on his journey. I mean, yeah, okay, it's not Spyro the Dragon without his sparkly sidekick to accompany him, but if someone could just give me some tape to make this game a bit more bearable, that would be great. Spyro comes across his most challenging foes so far, swamp monsters called growths that attack by smacking the ground with their clubs, or firing slime projectiles that slow Spyro down. Once the growths are defeated, the two brothers carry on through the swamp and run into none other than the red dragon from the beginning of the game. After Spyro throws a million questions a minute at him, he goes on to explain that he and 3 other guardians were tasked with protecting the dragon eggs and making sure they hatched, but they failed, and now the temple and grotto is completely overrun. We also learn more of this prophecy, which tells of a purple dragon that is only born once every 10 generations. That purple dragon is of course Spyro. The red dragon tells the two of the countless wars he and the other guardians fought in against the dark armies, and that they were almost about to turn the tide until Cinder came. One by one, she captured the guardians until only the red dragon remained, who reveals his name to be Ignitus. Spyro manages to convince Ignitus to stop moping around and lead him to the temple, so all 3 set off. Luckily, the temple isn't too far off, but it is overrun with apes, so Spyro travels through the area, killing every ape he sees and fixing the statue so that he, Sparx, and Ignitus can progress further in. A massive horde of apes suddenly attacks the 3, but Ignitus shows off his sick moves, smacking the invaders with headbutts and tail whips before letting loose a powerful fire spell. Fast forward through a bit more ape murder, and we finally arrive in the main section of the temple. The doors open to reveal a huge dragon statue in the centre of the temple. Jared Pullen revealed more about what this statue intended to represent, stating, "The image of the Great Guardian statue above was a homage to dragon culture in general, but more specifically, a stately and regal representation of an actual ancient dragon hero, the last purple dragon before Spyro's time. I pitched the idea that the statue itself was actually a representation of the Dark Master, before he renounced the path of good. So you could say that right from the beginning, from the new beginning, we had already caught a glimpse of the Dark Master. I thought it a very fitting and full circle type of thing to do. So, if we ever had a game where Spyro was a fully grown adult dragon, this is potentially what he looked like. Pretty cool! Anyway, carrying on with the story, Ignitus shows Spyro what has become of the islands, before taking him into the dojo for fire training, as well as some basic combat. It's here Spyro learns the ability that Ignitus used earlier against the ape horde, Fire Fury. When training is over, Ignitus heads to the Pool of Visions, where he sees the Guardian Volteer being held on Dante's freezer. Now Spyro gets his first proper mission, to fly to Dante's freezer and rescue the Guardian. Only problem with this plan? Spyro can't actually fly. at least not until Ignitus teaches him. Turns out all dragons have the ability to learn powers they never knew they had due to their connection to their ancient ancestors, which certainly makes life easier for Spyro. So off Spyro and Sparx fly to rescue Volteer. The two find themselves in an ancient snow-covered fortress, filled with catapults, spiked walls, and icicle traps. After about 5 minutes, I was already getting quite bored of this area, to be honest. It's just snow, spikes, and stone pretty much everywhere, and I was hoping that Volteer would turn up sooner rather than later so I could leave as soon as possible. As Spyro makes his way through the fortress, he'll come across a new enemy type: undead soldiers. They come in all shapes and sizes: the more common troll type, and the bulkier type known as ogres, which have 2 stages, an undead form and a wraith form. Lastly, troll horsemen will appear later in the fortress, who ride huge armoured mounts that look like undead oxen. While fighting these undead soldiers, a nearby tower suddenly zaps Spyro, but instead of doing serious damage to him, it instead bestows him with the power of electric stream breath. These soldiers seem to be at war with the apes, constantly fighting for dominion over the fortress. Speaking of the apes, they're the same design as those found in the swamp, only with a colour change. This will continue throughout A New Beginning. Same apes, same attacks, different colour. It's a little lazy in my opinion, especially given these guys make up the majority of the enemies in the game. It's also one of the reasons combat feels so lacklustre to me, but I'll talk about that later. The developers do try to spice things up a little bit by having said apes use catapults and turrets against Spyro, but seeing as these can be defeated in a few hits, they're not that impressive. Another new enemy is the Dreadwing, large bat-like creatures that the apes use for transportation as well as combat. They can be time-consuming to defeat due to being able to completely negate Spyro's breath attacks by shielding themselves with their wings, but overall they aren't too difficult to kill. These Dreadwings will also crop up frequently in the game in various colours. Partway through, Spyro gets his first glimpse of Cinder, albeit from very far away. Luckily, she doesn't spot the plucky purple dragon, so Spyro is free to carry on through the fortress, finally coming to an ice cave. Inside, he finds Volteer, but before he can help the Guardian, the resident Ice King boss takes a disliking to Sparx's inane chatter and jumps to life ready to fight the two. I'll take this opportunity to say that all the boss fights in A New Beginning are incredibly simple and rather lacklustre. You can easily kill most bosses by exploiting one move over and over. Regardless, I hadn't quite refined my dodging techniques, so this fight took me a couple of attempts. I'll go into more detail about the bosses later. Once the Ice King is defeated, Volteer is freed, and we find out he's as much a chatterbox as Sparx.
Spyro.
A purple dragon named Spyro. Amazing. Of course, there were unsubstantiated rumors of a purple dragon countless generations ago.
The three head back to the temple, where Volteer explains to Ignitus that Cinder was using him to power some sort of yellow orb. Ignitus, realising that something is afoot, tells the band that they need to rescue the other Guardians before Cinder can power any more orbs. But before that, Spyro needs to learn how to harness his newfound power over electricity, so it's off to the dojo with Volteer to train some more and learn a new ability, Electric Fury. Ignitus informs Spyro and Sparx that the next Guardian, Cyril, is being held in Tall Plains, so off Spyro goes to rescue him. Tall Plains is a series of islands connected by bridges and made up of jungles and sheer cliffs. There'll be a number of puzzles to complete here too, but nothing too complicated. Horn dive some switches, run up a seesaw, and roll some giant boulders. The usual stuff, you know. Ignitus gives us a little exposition about Tall Plains. It was once the home of a tribe known as the Atlawa, humanoid llama-like beings that Jared Pullen explains were modelled after the Aztecs. When Cinder arrived with her forces, the Atlawa were forced to flee underground, but Spyro gets a glimpse of them when he finds two who have been captured by the apes. One is transported away by a Dreadwing, but Spyro manages to rescue the other, called Cain. He's not very grateful to our plucky purple dragon, and sets off to try and rescue the rest of his tribe. As Spyro traverses the Tall Plains, he'll meet two new enemies: large armadillo creatures that roll into him and smack him with their tails, and rock golems known as rubble brutes, very slow moving foes that pack a nasty punch. Spyro will come to a clearing where he'll spot Cain in serious trouble. Before the Atlawa can meet his maker, Spyro breathes ice onto the river, which freezes the water solid and in turn stops Cain from plummeting down the waterfall. Yay, we learned Ice Stream Breath! A lot more fighting ensues, and we finally come to a locked door, which Cain explained leads to the shrine where the shrine god awaits. Apparently he's in a bad mood. Okay, I'm going to briefly sum up these next parts because I'm starting to get bored. Get on floating ship, smack some apes, get off floating ship, avoid log traps while horn diving switches, and meet up with Cain outside the shrine. Wait, how did he get here before Spyro? As I ask myself why the game couldn't let me take the same shortcut Cain used, Cinder flies overhead, even closer than before. She must have poor vision because she doesn't spot Spyro, so our dynamic duo are free to enter the shrine and attempt to rescue the Ice Guardian Cyril. Cain warns us of the shrine god's anger, but I'm left wondering if this giant stone sentinel is the god in question, because honestly, he's a complete pushover. Once Spyro has spam-dodged his way to victory, Cyril the incredibly rude is freed, and he, Spyro and Sparks return to the temple.
Yes, old boy, we'd like nothing more than to stay and be a part of your primitive barbaric society, but duty calls, duty calls.
The Guardians tell Spyro of the last dragon to free, Toridori. No points for guessing what he's a master of. And just like before, Spyro is ushered into the dojo, this time by Cyril, to learn more about his Ice Stream breath and gain a new ability, Ice Fury. After training is over, Ignitus tells the others of Cinder's potential plan. She intends to harness the power of all Guardians to unlock a portal, but Ignitus won't tell Spyro what this portal is. Like, why, dude? You're happy to send this young dragon out to do all the fighting for you and save the other Guardians, but you can't tell him what this portal is. Anyway, Spyro is sent off to Munitions Forge where Toridori is trapped. This area is made up of lava pits, a mine, and a large active volcano known as Boitzibig. Wait, boy is it big. Really? Who came up with these names? The volcano is so unstable that the inhabitants of the island, the Manwismalls, have to make their home underground. Manwismalls, Manwiasmalls. Someone in the development team was really having fun with these names, weren't they? The Manwismalls have been forced by Cinder to mine metals for the war machines the Dark Armies use in battle. As Spyro travels through the area and beats up more apes, he'll come across his first Manwismall called Moliere. Moliere explains that while most of his people are mining metals deep underground, the rest are being held in the caves, trapped by magical crystals that keep them from moving. Spyro and Moliere make an agreement. If Spyro frees all the Manwismalls, Moliere will tell him where to find Toridori. After freeing the rest of the tiny mole people and doing combat in the smallest room ever, Spyro heads back to Moliere, who tells him that Toridori is held prisoner in the centre of the volcano, and that if he finds and frees his brother, Exuma, the latter will tell him how to proceed. Travelling further into the island, Spyro comes across several new enemies: magma worms that spit fire and tail whip, fire beetles which are more a nuisance than dangerous, and finally the buffalo beetle, large scorpion-like creatures which do quite a lot of damage if Spyro gets caught between a rock and a hard place. They can not only attack with their pincers and tail, but also shoot fire from their stingers. Spyro will eventually come to an opening with some sort of bell shrine inside. Anyone else getting Okami vibes here? After being goaded by Sparks, Spyro rings the bell which sends it crashing down on Spyro's head. Well done, Sparks, you killed the hero. Oh wait, he's alive? And now he's learned a new breath, Earthshot. After killing 1 billion more apes, Spyro and Sparks find themselves in a clearing with a train. A conductor ape shouts orders at 2 underlings before hopping onto his train named Steam and chewing away. Pulling the various levers around the area will open up the door and allow Spyro and Sparks to chase after the train via a track cart, which is a pretty fun little section of gameplay. The ride is cut short, however, when the track cart plummets off the track and into a pool of lava, but luckily our heroes survive by the power of flight. Much bug squashing, ape smacking and train dodging later, Spyro finally comes across Moliere's brother, Exuma, and once the other Manwismalls have been freed from their cages, he explains where exactly to find Toridori and tells Spyro to watch out for the conductor who runs the train. I'm skipping through this part too because it's more or less the same as before: kill bugs and apes, save Manwismalls, and watch out for trains. Spyro eventually finds Toridori trapped in some sort of magical floating cage, but before he can rescue the Guardian, the conductor attacks with Steam the train. Time for another boss battle. This one's a little different from other bosses, as you're fighting the vehicle itself rather than the conductor, but it's really not difficult. Once Toridori is freed, a cutscene will play, and the Guardian tells Spyro and Sparks they need to get back to the temple as soon as possible and inform the others of Cinder's plans. Before they can do so, however, Cinder herself bursts out the lava and grabs the crystal powered by Toridori. Toridori tries to chase after Cinder, but she easily knocks him out of the sky with one wing slap. Toridori shouts at Spyro to escape, which gets the attention of the Black Dragon. Thanks a lot, dude. The next 2 minutes of gameplay are shockingly boring, which is a shame given Spyro's being chased after by Cinder, flying over and between lava pits and waterfalls, all while trying to dodge her breath attacks. Once the 2 minutes of I don't know why they bothered are over, another cutscene will play. Cinder chases relentlessly after Spyro, snapping at his heels before being attacked by Ignitus, who comes rushing in to save the day. A short fight ensues, and both Cinder and Ignitus plummet to the earth. Spyro desperately wants to save his mentor, but Toridori tells him he isn't ready to fight Cinder, because, you know, we haven't completed the mandatory dojo training for that. Once in the temple, and after a pep talk from Toridori, Spyro heads into the dojo with him to practice his new breath and learn the final ability, Earth Fury. Spyro and the Guardians then discuss their next plan of action to save Ignitus. If you hadn't guessed by now, Cinder needs Ignitus to power the last crystal, which will open the portal that was mentioned earlier. Toridori points Spyro in the right direction, telling him Ignitus is being held in Cinder's lair. When arriving, Spyro starts off in crystalline fields, but eventually moves on to the fortress itself. Jared Pullen explains that this place was intended to be a haven for Voltaire and other electric dragons. The spires on the towers were perfect conductors for all the lightning storms that occurred, and the electric dragons could divert the storms if needed. Once Cinder moved in, however, the storms became incredibly powerful and wild, due to nobody keeping them in check, hence why the skies are so dark and foreboding now. Besides the never-ending onslaught of apes, Spyro will come across electric leeches in the pools of water that can give him a painful zap if he gets too close. He'll also have to deal with laser traps, preventing him from progressing further until all enemies in the area are killed, and even towers that emit a powerful blast when anything steps into their beam of light, be it friend or foe. Another new enemy is the Conduit, a ball of energy that scouts the area for threats. If Spyro is spotted, the Conduit will attack by either slamming its body into him or by zapping him from afar. Lastly, we have the Crystal Brutes, which are similar to the Stone Brutes of Tall Plains, but made of crystal instead of rock, obviously. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail about exploring this place because, well, it was all a bit samey to be honest. You're either beating up waves and waves of enemies to move a bit further into the fortress, or completing mundane objectives to do so instead. For example, part of this level has you breaking crystal shards to raise a platform. Before you can do this, however, you need to defeat all the apes that charge in through the gates. This is incredibly simple to do if you use electric stream breath, as you can just pull them off the side of the platform, but it's the fact it goes on for so long. 7 minutes of beating up apes and breaking shards to move slightly higher up in the tower isn't my idea of fun. The only bit of fun I had in this place was dealing with the Electric King, but this fight was even easier than the Ice King with all my upgrades, so it didn't last long. Thankfully, reaching the top of the tower ends all this by playing a cutscene. Spyro finds Ignitus trapped within an electric prison, and he goes to destroy the crystal Ignitus is powering. Sparks finally has some words of wisdom, informing his purple partner that this all seems too easy, and it is, because Cinder turns up to stop him.
If only it were that easy, little one.
Ignitus begs Spyro to run, but Spyro is made of tougher stuff, and both Purple and Black Dragon do battle with each other. One disappointing penultimate boss fight later, Cinder grabs the fully charged crystal and flies away. Oh dear. At least Ignitus is freed. Spyro tells his mentor that something felt familiar about Cinder, and Ignitus decides now is the time to tell Spyro the truth. It just so happens that Cinder was born in the Year of the Dragon, the same year as Spyro. When Ignitus returned to the grotto after saving Spyro's egg, he found all the other eggs smashed by the Dark Armies, except one. Turns out the Dark Master, while simultaneously wanting to destroy all eggs to prevent the Purple Dragon from being born, also needs one born under the Year of the Dragon to open the portal that traps him. Talk about irony, eh? So the Dark Master is what's inside the portal that's been mentioned throughout this game. Who'da thunk it? Cinder is so large in comparison to Spyro because the Dark Master's powers twisted her and made her evil. You know, typical unwilling villain stuff. Ignitus explains that the Dark Master wants to be freed from the Portal of Convexity in order to bring disaster to every realm, and if Cinder brings the final crystal to his prison, this will be inevitable. Of course, the hero of the tale won't be having any of that. and after giving Ignitus his own pep talk, Spyro and Sparx fly off to stop Cinder once and for all. This leads our plucky purple dragon to the weirdest area so far, and my personal favourite of the whole game, Convexity. Convexity is a void dimension filled with huge planets and floating rocks, which Spyro can use to move about the area. It's inhabited by strange Lovecraftian creatures that resemble jellyfish and whales, which I think is about as dark as you can get before you terrify any children playing. At least, if I played this as a kid, I'd be pretty freaked out. Sadly, it's the least explored area of the game, with the only objective being jumping from rock to rock and occasional jellyfish to reach the final platform that houses the Portal of Convexity. It's here the final battle of the game takes place, though not against the Dark Master. I guess he's being saved for a later game. Instead, we fight Cinder again, and it's more or less the same as before, until the final stage. Hearing Ignitus' voice in his head, Spyro gains a new, mysterious power that finally puts an end to Cinder's evilness. Time for another cutscene! Cinder, having been drained of the Dark Master's power and influence, reverts back to a normal-sized dragon. The platform begins to collapse and the portal starts to suck in everything around it, but Spyro can't leave Cinder behind and flies through the portal to rescue her. Carrying Cinder, he and Sparx fly as fast as their wings can carry them. They manage to escape just in the nick of time and arrive back in their world. The camera fades to the temple, where Spyro and Cinder recover from their battle. Ignitus apologises to Cinder for failing her the night the Dark Army stole her egg, but is happy that they're all back together again. Aww. And the game can't possibly end without Sparx getting a few words in, much to the annoyance of everybody present, including me. Once the credits have finished rolling, a final cutscene will play, showing Spyro looking up into the night sky. He's joined by Cinder, and both share how they feel knowing the Dark Master is still out there. This is only the beginning. Look, I tied it into the game's title, aren't I clever? Now we can move on to gameplay. I'm gonna say it now, this is the biggest gripe I have with A New Beginning. They made such an awesome story that I enjoyed every second of, and then ruined it with monotonous, repetitive gameplay. For those of you who have never played this game, let me fill you in with some rough numbers. 85% of your time will be spent beating something up, 10% is training in the dojo or solving very easy puzzles, and the remaining 5% will be dialogue. The only one I don't have a real problem with is the latter. The rest are handled so poorly in this game that, unless you enjoy beating up the same mobs over and over, or working out puzzles that a 6-year-old would have no issues with, you're not going to enjoy the gameplay. Let's talk about controlling Spyro, as well as the different gauges that can be seen on the top left of the screen. So, to move Spyro and control the camera, use the left analog stick and right analog stick respectively. Pressing X will make Spyro jump, and holding it down after jumping will have him slowly glide to the floor. He can even double jump like in Ahira's tail by double tapping X. Charging is very different in A New Beginning, as not only do you have to hold down R1 to do it, you have very little control whilst performing the charge. Previous games had you use it to quickly move around the map or take out enemies. But it's so difficult to turn while charging in A New Beginning that I barely used it at all. Spyro's various breath attacks feel very different too, but before we discuss them, let's go into more detail about those gauges. The red gauge signifies Spyro's health, green is used to perform his various breath attacks, and the purple circular gauge is for the big Fury elemental attacks. The icon in the centre of the purple gauge informs you of which breath you're using. To fill these gauges, Spyro will have to collect the various gems that drop off enemies or broken crystals. The gem colour relates to the gauge, and whilst the red and the green gauge fill up relatively quickly, you'll need a lot of purple gems to fill the Fury gauge, as Fury attacks are Spyro's most devastating abilities. There are 4 elemental breath attacks in total: fire, electric, ice, and earth. As long as you have resource left in the green gauge, each element can be used in a short-range breath attack by holding square, or a long-range breath attack by pressing triangle, and each has different effects on the enemy. These breaths can be upgraded further by way of the level up menu, but before you can do this, you need to have collected enough blue gems from enemies and crystals to increase Spyro's spirit energy. This level up system completely threw me. I didn't realise until much later in the game that the pot on the bottom left signifies how much spirit energy Spyro has to spend. You're supposed to hold down X on the breath you want to upgrade, and wait for the chime to signify it's finished. Because I couldn't see the pot going down in resource, I figured it wasn't working. This was also not helped by the fact it takes a while to upgrade these breaths. You're sometimes holding down X for 10 seconds at a time before you hear the level up chime. I finally worked out how the upgrade system worked in Munitions Forge, and by that point I had enough spirit energy to upgrade my breaths multiple times in one sitting. Needless to say, it made combat a lot less tedious from then on. Let's talk about the short range breath attacks, their effects, and how useful they are in the game. Fire is the first breath Spyro acquires, and it's not a bad one at that. Enemies set on fire lose health for as long as you keep torching them, and while they try to desperately put themselves out, you can give them a good whack or two. The second breath Spyro learns, electricity, was by far the most useful to me in later levels. While it doesn't seem that fantastic at first, only used to stun foes for a short time, Spyro later learns to throw enemies around with it, regardless of their size. Using it to pull an enemy off a tall enough ledge will instantly kill them, and you can still collect the gems they drop. If they're thrown off into a bottomless pit, the gems will even fly towards Spyro, so it's an incredibly fast and easy way to gain spirit energy. The next breath, Ice, is the one I use the least on account of it being a little meh. Maybe I was using it wrong and didn't realise its full potential, but from what I could tell, it only slowed certain enemies for a few seconds and turned others into giant snowballs. While this sounds pretty cool, it's actually a pain in the butt, as Spyro then latches onto the snowball and pushes it around. I just want to kill the bad guy dude, not play with them. The last breath, Earth, is a very powerful one to use, and when I wasn't throwing enemies off cliffs with electricity, this was my go-to breath of choice. It actually has the same effect if you aim it correctly next to a ledge. It's able to knock foes back a significant distance, and if you can get them trapped against a wall, it can even finish off their entire health bar in a few blasts. The long-range breath attacks, which look like balls of elemental energy, all have a similar function: to incapacitate and/or damage the enemy over a short period of time. Fireball throws an enemy into the air and knocks down other targets around them. Electric Arc is heat-seeking and will entrap the foe in an electric cage, so Spyro has more time to perform aerial moves. Ice Shards can be used to freeze an enemy in place, which is especially useful on faster-moving targets. And finally, Earth Bomb can be used to trap enemies in a whirlwind, so it has a similar function to Electric Arc. His final elemental-based attacks, the Furies, are all performed by pressing R2 once the purple gauge is filled. They each have a similar animation. Time slows down as Spyro jumps into the air and releases a huge wave of elemental power in all directions. Not much else to say really. They look pretty cool, and they can deal significant damage to all enemies in the area, but that's about it. Though I've talked at length about Spyro's various breath attacks, the majority of combat is melee-based, so I should go into more detail about that. Spyro is able to perform various melee attacks both on the ground and in the air, and by pressing the right button combinations, he can do some pretty cool things. Ignitus shows us a lot of these when Spyro trains with him in the dojo, but I hardly use most of them. Instead, I ended up mashing the circle button pretty much all the time, or at least in earlier fights. And here is where another problem with the combat lies: it's way too easy. Though mashing the same button can get Spyro into trouble when an enemy counters or isn't thrown off balance, most foes aren't worth worrying about. For example, the smaller apes Spyro faces can be killed with a few smacks, and any damage he takes while you recklessly mash circle is negated by the red gems they drop, which nearly fills his health bar to full again. Killing foes with only the circle button is made even easier when you master the strafe and dodge abilities. Strafing is performed by holding down L1 to keep the camera on a target while Spyro circles them, and dodging is performed by tapping X while holding down L1 to quickly move out of the way of an attack. Later in the game, I was avoiding most melee fights anyway by abusing Electric Breath's ability to pull enemies off ledges. There's one other melee ability I haven't really mentioned, the Horn Dive, performed by jumping and pressing R1. Again, this sees so little use in the game that it's hardly worth talking about, only used for puzzles in tall planes and certain melee combinations. In all, the melee combat offers very little in terms of engagement, especially when it's the same type of enemies you've already fought multiple times as you travel through each area. Besides fighting tooth and claw on the ground, Spyro can occasionally take the fight to the skies after Ignitus shows him how to fly. Seeing this for the first time in A New Beginning, I was really hoping this was going to make up for the lackluster ground combat. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite live up to expectations. This rail shooter style of gameplay is only used twice in the entire game. first when Spyro heads to Dante's freezer to rescue Voltaire, and during the chase sequence with Cinder, with the latter giving you even less to do than the former. I have no idea why it wasn't used when Spyro travels to Tall Plains, Munitions Forge or Cinder's lair, but I guess the developers have their reasons. Controls while flying are L1 and R1 to slow down or speed up respectively, and triangle button to fireball attack the various enemies and turrets that are in Spyro's way. There's also a barrel roll ability, accomplished by pushing left or right on the left analog stick and tapping X, but I never use this myself. Now I've gone over Spyro's abilities and melee attacks, it's time to look at gameplay in general. Once Spyro, Sparx and Ignitus have liberated the temple, the game can be broken down to 4 parts from here on. Go to a new island, learn a new breath, kill the boss in order to rescue the Guardian, and finally head back to the temple and train with said Guardian. This wouldn't be much of a problem for me if 1, the islands weren't so linear, 2, the bosses were a bit more of a challenge, and 3, the dojo training wasn't such a waste of time. I haven't got too much of an issue with Spyro learning the various breath attacks, because Ignitus did explain to Spyro that in times of crisis, his ancestors would teach him new powers he never knew he had. If being trapped under a bell counts as a time of crisis, then fair enough. Exploring the various islands in A New Beginning is so far the most linear experience I've had playing a Spyro game. Unlike A Hero's Tale where you had multiple areas to explore in a realm, A New Beginning gives you one path to follow and one path only. There also seems to be no backtracking in this game. At least I never felt the need to go back to an island, and I don't even know if you can, to be honest. Though some people might see this as more of a positive, because I know backtracking isn't everybody's cup of tea. So going from point A to point B isn't exactly my idea of fun, but it could have been made so much better if there was more to do. Most of the time you'll move into a new area, watch a bunch of apes turn up to fight Spyro, and then you'll beat them all up and continue on to the next area where the same thing happens. Rinse and repeat until you come to the big bad boss, which now gives me a chance to go into a little more detail about the boss battles. They're a bit more entertaining than the usual enemies, but as I said before, they don't take much to defeat. The first boss is the Ice King, a heavily armoured troll who holds Voltaire prisoner inside of an ice cave on Dante's freezer. He has 3 stages, but he does the same attacks each time. He'll first summon an ice sword and shield to use against Spyro, but his swings can easily be avoided by strafing and dodging. Spyro can even destroy the shield with fire breath attacks, leaving the Ice King vulnerable, but he is able to make a new one after a short time. Every so often he'll summon a bubble shield to protect himself, and can even shoot out ice shards, either over his head or through the ground. These are incredibly easy to avoid, either by running away or jumping, and they even drop red and green gems so Spyro can recover his health and breath gauge. As the fight moves into different stages, the Ice King will keep shedding his armour until you can see his skeletal remains underneath. A few more whacks in the final stage and the Ice King will drop to the floor and die. The next boss, the stone sentinel that holds Cyril prisoner, was even easier to defeat than the Ice King. Again, this fight has 3 stages, but I was able to cheese it the entire time by waiting for the stone sentinel to do his incredibly predictable punch attack, dodging out of the way at the last second, and giving his arm a good smack. Repeat this for a century, and you'll easily win the fight. He does have other attacks, such as rotating the top half of his body, or kicking out at Spyro, but these can be avoided by not going near him and waiting for the punch attack instead. The third boss, the Conductor and Steam, are a little more annoying. They guard Toridori, and again there are 3 stages. Steam will move along the train tracks, and the Conductor will try and run Spyro over with a locomotive, but standing on the tracks is necessary in order to trick the Conductor into driving Steam into a wall. This gives you time to unleash devastating Earthshot attacks against Steam. You can also do damage to Steam as it passes Spyro by on the tracks, but by far the best way to damage it is the wall tactic. What makes this fight more annoying is that Steam will shoot out explosive rocks, so you have to keep Spyro moving, but overall it's not a difficult fight. Next up is the Electric King, fought outside the main fortress of Cinder's lair with 3 stages. Not much to say about this one, as it's pretty much the same fight as the Ice King, only the Electric King is made up of crystal and electricity and has crystal-based attacks. He was incredibly easy for me to defeat, as by this point, my breath attacks had been upgraded so much I was taking chunks of his health off in a few hits. Lastly are the 2 fights with Cinder. The first fight is over relatively quickly as she only has 1 stage at this point. She'll mainly attack Spyro with wing slaps and tail whips, but you can easily defeat her by spamming Earthshot. When you catch up with Cinder again in Convexity, there's a bit more to the fight as there are 3 stages. The first stage has her attacking in the same way as she did before, but the second stage will be a mix. She'll continue to attack Spyro, but will occasionally take off and breathe fire along the platform. This is easily avoided by standing on the inside edge. The last stage is arguably the coolest. Cinder will hover above Spyro and shoot out fire blasts, and all Spyro can do in terms of movement is strafe left and right. He can, however, fire powerful purple blasts at Cinder. Once the purple gauge is filled using these blasts, and you hear Ignitus' voice, you can use Spyro's most powerful fury yet. And that's all the boss fights of A New Beginning. There's not much else to say about the gameplay. I should talk a bit more about the dojo training, but it's just the same thing 4 times over. Ignitus has the longest training out of all 4 Guardians, as the game feels it's necessary to tell me how to fight, even though I've been doing so all the way up to reaching the temple. The rest of the training consists of practicing your breath attacks against the dummies in various ways, and using your fury attack. That's pretty much it. So let's move on to music and voice work. The music of the Legend of Spyro trilogy was composed by Rebecca Newbell and Gabriel Mann. Both Newbell and Mann are composers from Los Angeles, and have worked on scores for film, television and video games. Besides the Legend of Spyro series, they've also worked together on soundtracks for The Saboteur, Crash Twinsanity, Fear Perseus Mandate, and Time Shift. Unlike previous soundtracks for Spyro games, which were always very bouncy or whimsical to match the tone of the game, the music of A New Beginning is very orchestral and dramatic, making use of choir vocals and classical instruments. This matches the darker and more serious tone of A New Beginning story. Just listen to the theme for the battle with Cinder in Convexity as an example. However, the scores aren't always dark and foreboding. They can be lighter-hearted from time to time, with a good example being the title screen theme. In terms of voice work, we've got a few famous names here. Now, normally I list off the actors and give you some examples of films, TV shows, or other games they've starred or voice acted in, but seeing as the first few are big stars, I don't think it's necessary for them. So first of all, we have Mr. Frodo himself, Elijah Wood as the voice of Spyro. It's kind of funny that he stars in this, given how often people compare the Legend of Spyro characters to the Lord of the Rings characters. You've got the unprepared but determined protagonist, the elder father figure who puts himself in harm's way to protect our young hero, the incorporeal but malevolent force. Yeah, I can see some similarities between the two, but I digress. Let's carry on with the voice actors. So next up we have an even bigger name than Elijah Wood. It's of course Gary Oldman, the man with 1,000 faces, or in this case voices. He's the voice of the Fire Guardian and Spyro's mentor, Ignitus. And I have to say he pulls it off brilliantly, but that's to be expected from an actor with his level of talent. And then we have David Spade as the voice of Sparks. When I first started A New Beginning and saw his name on the opening credits, I wasn't too concerned, as to be honest, the only thing I've heard David Spade in up until now was The Emperor's New Groove, and I love that film. But my gosh was he irritating as the voice of Sparks.
My dear Outlaws, I am the mighty Sparks, scourge of the despots.
Okay, to be fair on the dude, that's more down to the writing than his voice. But the character of Sparks just feels so out of place in such a dark story with serious characters, and that problem is exacerbated by David Spade's over-the-top comedic voice. Now we can move on to a few lesser-known actors, at least when compared to Elijah Wood and Gary Oldman. Cree Summer voices Cinder, but she has had tons of voice acting roles. Her most notable include Number 5 from Codename Kids Next Door, Susie Carmichael from Rugrats, and Princess Kaida from Atlantis The Lost Empire. Corey Burton voices Voltaire and Exuma. His most notable voice acting roles include Brainiac and Hugo Strange from various DC animated shows and video games, and the Decepticon Shockwave from Transformers, with his earliest role as the character dating back to 1984. Next up we have Jeff Bennett, who voiced Cyril, Sparks' father, Moliere, and a number of other voices. By far his most notable voice acting role has got to be as the smooth-talking womanizer Johnny Bravo. Kevin Michael Richardson voices Toridori and the conductor. If you want deep, booming voice, Kevin is your guy, and I'm sure a lot of you who played A New Beginning instantly recognised him as the voice of Captain Gantu from the Lilo & Stitch films and TV shows. Phil LaMarr only had a small role in A New Beginning, as the voice of Kane, but I knew there was something about Kane's voice that I recognised, so I was pleasantly surprised to see that Phil had done a number of voice acting roles for characters I adore. His most famous has got to be everybody's favourite time-travelling warrior, Samurai Jack. But he's also voiced other favourites of mine such as Jon Stewart from Justice League, Virgil Hawkins from Static Shock, and even Wilt from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. I miss my childhood. Finally, we have Vanessa Marshall, who voiced Sparks' mother. The only voice acting role I recognise of hers is as scaredy cat Erwin from The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. So now that's out of the way, let's move on to the final part. Critical reception. The PS2, GameCube, Nintendo DS and Xbox versions of The Legend of Spyro: A New Beginning received mixed to positive reviews upon release. The Game Boy Advance version was not as popular, which is understandable given it looked and felt like a totally different game compared to the other versions. Even the dialogue was completely changed in places to better fit the side-scrolling action. IGN were quite positive about A New Beginning on the PS2, GameCube and Xbox, stating, "The Legend of Spyro: A New Beginning caught us entirely by surprise. We assumed the attempt at revitalising the series would be purely at face value, but are pleasantly surprised to see that the franchise has gotten a serious lift in nearly every area. We would have sped up the overall melee attacks a bit and dropped the amount of health per baddie, but aside from a few minor tweaks, the game is very rewarding." The Nintendo DS version, while not quite as popular, still fared well under IGN's scrutiny. Their reviewer, Craig Harris, stated, "I was a little disappointed to find out that the adventuring element was almost completely removed from the design, but I continued to warm up to the game as the action heated up. The touchscreen targeting is pretty clever, as is the way the designers change up button and touchscreen control during the action. The game still needs a bit of tightening up, the frame rate's a bit of a drag at times, and the boss battles are very uncreative, but overall this actionized Spyro game is a solid and surprising design on the Nintendo DS. In comparison, the review for the Game Boy Advance version was not so positive. IGN reviewer, Jack DeVries, stated, "He's seen his ups and downs on nearly every major console since the PlayStation. The GBA had been good to our purple hero though, and for years, fans could count on some really solid Spyro action on the handheld. The Legend of Spyro: A New Beginning fails to capture the appeal that the past games had. The graphics are pretty bland, and for the gameplay, while at first glance promising, turns out to be insultingly easy. For long-time fans of the series, this game is going to be a letdown, and newcomers that are picking up a Spyro game for the first time are going to get burned. Oh dear. Maybe I'll do a video on the Game Boy Advance version just for laughs." To this day on GameRankings.com, the Legend of Spyro: A New Beginning rankings go as follows. PS2, 64.52% based on 21 reviews, GameCube 67.17% based on 12 reviews, Xbox 71.27% based on 11 reviews, Nintendo DS 68.22% based on 9 reviews, and finally the Game Boy Advance 44.67% based on 3 reviews. So as you probably guessed from watching my video, I had a few ups and downs with A New Beginning. The story was engaging and I loved most of the characters. Most. I'm looking at you, Sparks. And even though I still think he's rather goofy looking, this iteration of Spyro has really grown on me. He comes across as a very realistic character, at least as realistic as a purple dragon that breathes fire, electricity, ice and earth can be. He is unsure of himself at times, but he never gives up, especially if it's to protect friends and family, a very admirable trait. Likewise, the 4 Guardians are all interesting characters in their own ways. Ignitus is a wise leader, Voltaire is incredibly smart and a hilarious chatterbox, Cyril is rather pompous and direct, and Toridori is a strong and noble warrior. The only character I'm a little disappointed by is Cinder, but only because I really wanted to see more of her, both evil and good. Luckily, I still have 2 games involving her to enjoy. The downside to the awesome story and all these great characters is definitely the gameplay. It's so repetitive. Do I really need to go back to the dojo each time Spyro gets a new breath? It's all the same moves anyway, just with a different element. And could we have a bit of variation with the enemies? Because fighting apes got old about halfway through Dante's Freezer. The worst of it all, when the game did change things up a little bit, it was only for 3 short sections of gameplay. Regardless, I did have more fun with A New Beginning than I was expecting to. It's a fairly solid reboot to the Spyro series, with dynamic characters, an interesting story, and beautiful graphics. The original series is still my baby though. And that's it for my retrospective on The Legend of Spyro: A New Beginning. Join me next time when I have a go at the second game in the series, The Eternal Night. Oh, and I now have a Patreon page, yay! So if any of you would like to support me in the channel, you can find a link to my Patreon in the description. And before I end this video, shout out to Travis Zielinski and Ray Bungart for supporting me and the channel via Patreon. If I'm butchering your names, guys, I'm really sorry. Let me know how to pronounce them properly. Thank you so much, guys, and I'll see you either in the next livestream or history video. Bye bye!